You don't lack intelligence, you lack honesty with yourself. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting quietly behind all your effort, all your late nights, all your carefully organized notes. You've convinced yourself that time spent equals progress made, but your mind knows better. You feel it in those moments when a simple question shakes you, when you hesitate, when your confidence collapses under pressure. That hesitation is not a lack of ability, it's a lack of real understanding. And instead of confronting that gap, you cover it. You move faster. You distract yourself with more content. You chase the illusion of productivity because it feels safer than facing the possibility that you don't actually get it. But here's the reality you've been avoiding. Pretending to understand is the fastest way to guarantee that you never will. Your brain isn't fooled by your notes, your highlights, or your routines. It responds only to clarity. And clarity demands brutal honesty. It demands that you stop and admit, I don't understand this. Not quietly, not vaguely, clearly and directly. That moment of admission is where real learning begins, but it's also where most people quit, because it's uncomfortable. It challenges your identity. It forces you to drop the act. But if you can't face that discomfort, you'll stay trapped in a cycle of fake progress. You'll keep moving but never forward. You'll keep studying but never learning. And the worst part is, you'll start believing that this is just how it is. It's not. You're not stuck. You're just avoiding the one thing that actually works. Honesty isn't just a trait here. It's the foundation. Without it, everything you build collapses the moment it's tested. With it, even the hardest concepts become manageable. So the question is simple, and it cuts deep. Are you ready to stop lying to yourself, or are you going to keep pretending until reality forces the truth on you? You've built a system that protects your ego instead of strengthening your mind. It looks productive from the outside. Pages filled with notes, definitions copied word for word, diagrams that look impressive but mean very little to you. You sit there, reading, rereading, highlighting, thinking you're doing the work, but you're not engaging. You're observing. You're standing on the surface of ideas instead of diving into them. And the reason is simple. You've learned to confuse familiarity with understanding. When something looks recognizable, you assume you know it. But recognition is not comprehension. It's a shallow illusion. It's why you can read a paragraph 5 times and still struggle to explain it in your own words. Because you never forced your brain to process it. You only exposed it. Real learning doesn't happen through exposure. It happens through reconstruction. When you take an idea and rebuild it from scratch in your own language, that's when it becomes yours. But that process is slow, messy, and uncomfortable. It forces you to confront gaps you didn't know existed. It makes you feel lost before you feel clear. And most people avoid that feeling at all costs. They'd rather stay in the comfort of recognition than face the discomfort of confusion. So they keep reading, keep watching, keep nodding, and keep believing they're making progress. But when it's time to use that knowledge, everything falls apart. Because nothing was ever built. It was only borrowed. And borrowed knowledge doesn't hold under pressure. It disappears the moment you need it most. If you want to break this cycle, you have to change the way you approach information. Stop treating it like something to collect. Start treating it like something to challenge. Question every step. Break every idea. Simplify until there's nothing left to hide behind. Because if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, no amount of repetition will save you. Real learning is not comfortable. It's not smooth. It doesn't feel like progress most of the time. It feels like failure, again and again. You sit with an idea, and it doesn't make sense. You try to explain it, and you stumble. You think you've got it, and then one question destroys your confidence. That's not a sign that you're incapable. That's the process working exactly as it should. But you've been trained to avoid that feeling. You've been taught to seek correctness, to chase right answers, to measure your ability by how often you get things right the first time. And that mindset is killing your growth. Because real understanding is built on repeated failure. It's built on pushing into confusion, not escaping from it. Every time you hit a wall and stay there, something changes in your brain. Connections form, patterns become clearer. But that only happens if you don't run away. And most people run. They switch topics. They look for easier material. They convince themselves they'll come back later. But later never comes, and the gaps remain. Over time, those gaps stack up. They become weaknesses you can't ignore. And suddenly, everything feels harder than it should be. Not because you're not smart enough, but because you never allowed yourself to struggle when it mattered. You avoided the very process that builds strength. So now you're forced to face it at a higher level, under more pressure, with less time. That's the cost of avoiding discomfort early. But it doesn't have to stay that way. You can choose differently. You can decide that confusion is not your enemy, it's your guide. It shows you exactly where to focus, exactly where to push, exactly where to grow. But only if you stop treating it like something to escape. The moment you change your relationship with confusion is the moment your learning changes completely. You've been measuring progress the wrong way. You think hours matter. You think finishing chapters matters. You think completing tasks means you're moving forward. But none of that guarantees understanding. You can sit for 10 hours and learn nothing. You can finish an entire book and still be unable to explain the core ideas. Time is not the metric. Completion is not the goal. Clarity is. And clarity is ruthless. It doesn't care how long you've studied or how much effort you've put in. It only cares about one thing: can you make the idea simple? Can you break it down to its core? Can you explain it in a way that leaves no room for confusion? If the answer is no, then you're not done. No matter how much time you've spent, no matter how tired you feel, no matter how much you want to move on, that's the standard. And it's a standard most people never reach because they never hold themselves to it. They settle for good enough. They settle for partial understanding. And that's why their knowledge collapses under pressure, because it was never solid to begin with. It was built on shortcuts. But shortcuts don't hold. They fail when it matters most. The real shift happens when you stop chasing completion and start chasing clarity. When you refuse to move forward until something makes complete sense. That slows you down. It feels inefficient. It feels like you're falling behind, but you're not. You're building something that lasts. You're creating a foundation that supports everything that comes after. And once that foundation is strong, everything else becomes easier, faster, more intuitive. Because you're not just remembering information, you're understanding it. And that changes everything. So stop counting hours. Stop racing through material. Start asking one question over and over again. Do I truly understand this? And if the answer is no, stay there. That's where the real work is. Your notes are not proof of learning. They're evidence of activity. And activity is easy. It feels productive. It gives you something to look at, something to show, something to point to and say, I did the work. But deep down, you know that's not enough. Because when you close those notes, when you remove that safety net, everything becomes uncertain. You struggle to recall. You struggle to explain. You struggle to connect ideas. And that's because your notes did the thinking for you. You wrote things down without processing them. You copied structure without building understanding. And now you're dependent on those pages. Without them, your knowledge disappears. That's not learning, that's storage. And storage is fragile. It breaks under pressure. The real test is simple and brutal. Close everything. No notes, no books, no prompts. Now explain the idea out loud as if you're teaching someone who knows nothing about it. Not in complicated terms, not using memorized phrases. In your own words. Step by step. If you can do that clearly, you understand it. If you can't, you found the gap. And that gap is where your focus should be. Not on rewriting notes, not on adding more information, on fixing that specific weakness. That's how you improve. Not by doing more, but by targeting what you don't understand. But this requires discipline. It requires you to stop hiding behind your notes and start testing yourself honestly. It requires you to accept that your current method might not be working, even if it feels comfortable. And that's hard, because it challenges your habits. It forces change. But without that change, nothing improves. You stay stuck in the same cycle, so break it. Use your notes as a tool, not a crutch. Build understanding that exists without them, because that's the only kind of knowledge that actually stays with you. You don't need more information. You need more engagement. Right now, you're overloaded. Videos, books, lectures, explanations, endless streams of content pouring into your mind. And it feels like progress. It feels like you're doing everything you should. But you're not giving your brain the one thing it actually needs: time to process. You're consuming faster than you can understand. And that creates a dangerous illusion. You feel informed, but you're not equipped. You recognize ideas, but you can't use them. And that gap becomes obvious the moment you're tested. Because passive learning doesn't build skill. It builds familiarity. And familiarity is weak. It fades quickly. It doesn't hold under pressure. If you want to change that, you have to shift from consuming to engaging. That means slowing down. Taking one idea at a time and working with it actively. Asking questions. Challenging assumptions. Breaking it into parts and rebuilding it. That process is demanding. It requires focus. It requires patience. It forces you to think deeply instead of skimming the surface. And that's why most people avoid it. They prefer the ease of consumption. It feels smoother, it feels faster, but it leads nowhere. Because without engagement, nothing sticks. So reduce your input. Stop chasing more content. Take what you already have and go deeper, much deeper. Extract every detail. Understand every connection. Push until the idea becomes clear and simple. That's where real learning happens. Not in the volume of information you consume, but in the depth of understanding you build. And once you experience that depth, everything changes. You stop feeling overwhelmed. You start feeling in control. Because you're no longer drowning in information. You're mastering it. Speed has become your obsession. Finish quickly. Move on. Cover more ground. It feels efficient. It feels like you're staying ahead, but speed is hiding your weaknesses. Every time you rush through a concept, you skip the parts that don't make sense. You ignore the questions that slow you down. You trade depth for momentum, and that trade is costing you more than you realize. Because what you skip doesn't disappear. It stays with you. It builds up. And over time, those small gaps turn into major obstacles. Suddenly, advanced topics feel impossible. Not because they are, but because your foundation is weak. You move too fast to build it properly, and now everything on top of it is unstable. The solution is simple, but it goes against everything you've been doing. Slow down. Intentionally. Choose depth over speed. Stay with a concept until it's clear. Not partially clear. Completely clear. That takes time. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like you're falling behind others who are moving faster, but they're not ahead, they're just moving. And movement without understanding is meaningless. Real progress is not measured by how much you cover, but by how well you understand what you've covered. When you slow down, something powerful happens. You start noticing details you missed before. You start making connections. You start thinking instead of reacting. And that changes the entire learning experience. It becomes less about finishing and more about mastering. Less about quantity and more about quality. And that shift creates a level of confidence that speed can never give you. Because you're not just moving through information, you're owning it. You've been trying to look smart instead of becoming clear. You use complex language. You repeat definitions exactly as they were written. You rely on technical terms to carry your explanation. And it works for a while. It convinces others. It even convinces you. But it doesn't hold up under pressure. Because complexity can hide confusion. Simplicity cannot. When you're forced to explain something in simple terms, without jargon, without memorized phrases, without shortcuts, the truth becomes obvious. Either you understand it or you don't. And that's why simplicity is so powerful. It removes the mask. It exposes the gaps. It forces clarity. But achieving simplicity is not easy. It requires deep understanding. It requires you to strip away everything unnecessary and focus on the core idea. That takes effort. It takes time. It takes repeated attempts. But once you reach that level, something changes. The concept becomes intuitive. It becomes part of how you think. You don't have to recall it. You just know it. And that's the goal. Not to sound intelligent, but to think clearly. Because clear thinking leads to better decisions, better answers, better performance. It gives you an edge that memorization never will. So stop trying to impress. Stop trying to sound advanced. Start focusing on clarity. Take every concept and ask yourself, can I make this simple? Can I explain it in a way that anyone can understand? If not, keep working. Because that's where the real value is. Not in how complex something sounds, but in how clearly it can be understood. No one is coming to fix this for you. Not your teachers, not your books, not any system you're part of. They can guide you, they can provide information, but they cannot do the thinking for you. And that's where most people fail. They wait. They expect clarity to come from outside. They expect explanations to solve everything. But understanding is built internally. It's the result of your effort, your questioning, your persistence. If you stay passive, you stay dependent. And dependency limits you. Because the moment you're on your own, everything falls apart. You hesitate, you second guess, you struggle. Not because you're incapable, but because you never developed the ability to think independently. And that ability is critical. It's what allows you to solve new problems, to adapt, to grow beyond what you've been taught. But it only develops when you take responsibility, when you stop waiting and start engaging, when you stop blaming external factors and start focusing on what you can control. Your effort, your approach, your mindset. That shift is not easy. It requires discipline. It requires consistency. It requires you to hold yourself accountable, even when no one else is watching. But it's necessary, because without it you remain stuck, limited by what others provide, controlled by circumstances. But with it you gain independence. You become capable of learning anything, understanding anything, solving anything with enough effort. And that's the real goal. Not just to pass exams or complete tasks, but to build a mind that can handle complexity, that can break down problems, that can think clearly under pressure. And that starts with you. No shortcuts, no excuses. So here's what you're going to do. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready. Now, you're going to take one concept, just one, and you're going to face it honestly. No distractions, no shortcuts, no pretending. You're going to break it down step by step. You're going to question every part of it. Why does it work? How does it connect to what you already know? What happens if you change something? You're going to push until it becomes clear, not partially clear, completely clear. And then you're going to do the hardest part. You're going to explain it out loud, in simple words, as if you're teaching someone who has no background, no context, no prior knowledge. And if you struggle, if you hesitate, if you get stuck, you're not going to move on. You're going to go back. You're going to find the gap, and you're going to fix it. That's the process. It's simple, but it's not easy. It requires focus. It requires patience. It requires you to confront your weaknesses directly instead of avoiding them. But if you commit to it, something changes. Your understanding deepens. Your confidence grows. Your ability to think improves. And over time, that compounds. One concept becomes two. Two becomes 10. And suddenly, you're not just keeping up, you're ahead. Not because you're faster, but because you're stronger. Because you built your knowledge the right way, from the ground up, without shortcuts, without illusions, just clarity. And that clarity becomes your advantage. So the choice is yours, and it's simpler than you think. You can keep doing what you've been doing. Keep consuming. Keep memorizing. Keep pretending. And maybe you'll get by. Maybe you'll pass. Maybe you'll survive the system. But you won't grow. You won't develop the kind of understanding that actually matters. Or you can change. You can drop the act. You can face the discomfort. You can commit to clarity, to depth, to real learning. It's harder. It takes more effort. It forces you to confront things you've been avoiding. But it works. And once you see the difference, once you feel what real understanding is like, there's no going back. Because you realize how much time you've wasted on methods that don't deliver. You realize how much potential you've been holding back. And that realization hits hard. But it also gives you control. Because now you know what to do. Now you know what matters. And the only question left is whether you're willing to act on it. Not later. Not when it's convenient. Now. Because every moment you delay is another moment you stay the same. And if you're serious about changing that, then prove it. Take action. Do the work. Build the clarity. Or accept the consequences of staying where you are. There's no middle ground.